What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. It's a cool, rainy day here in early spring in the southern hemisphere at our retreat center in the Andes Mountains of Chile. We have a couple of volunteers here now helping out, and today we took down our greenhouse because it was falling apart, and we're rebuilding it as we speak. And so if you hear some hammers banging outside, that's what's going on. And we're preparing the greenhouse to plant soon. Hopefully within the next couple of weeks we'll go ahead and start planting so that we have some vegetables ready for the summer when we start to have more guests. I've been making quite a few podcast episodes and YouTube videos lately because I have the time to do it, and really through November November through April is our busiest part of the year, and I don't have nearly as much time during the warmer months here because there's so many people coming in and out of the retreat center, and so I just don't have enough time to produce podcasts and YouTube videos and all that, write blogs and whatnot. So I have been making a lot, but it will certainly slow down in a month or so. And we're also looking to do some traveling here soon. Chile, just finally, it's October of 2022, and they just now lifted the what's called the Pase de Movilidad here, which is like the vaccine passport mandate, and they just finally lifted that, all those restrictions and the mask mandates and all of that, finally catching up to the rest of the world. So that's really nice. So we'll be doing some more traveling, thank goodness. So today I'm going to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, and I don't want to do too much review here, so I ask humbly that you please go back and listen to the previous episodes that I've done on the Gospel of Thomas and the Essenes, so that you are more familiar with the history of the Gospel of Thomas. But a very quick review. The Gospel of Thomas, according to the scholarship of Helmut Kester and others, Elaine Pagels and others, was most likely the original teachings of Jesus based on the so-called Q source, or the Q material, and which were, we believe, the original writings of Jesus's early followers or disciples or scribes associated with his disciples. And some of those Q teachings were preserved in the canonical Gospels, but primarily the earliest stuff was preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in the 1940s in Egypt, and that's a basic history of the Gospel of Thomas, but it's essentially Jesus' original teachings before they were corrupted in the canonical Gospels and before they were corrupted by Paul and others. and they're very mystical teachings, and they have a lot in common with yoga teachings and Buddhist teachings, teachings of Eastern philosophy and the Eastern religions. And so that's why I like to talk about them on the Western Yoga podcast, because it is essentially Western yoga teachings, if you want to consider, uh, ancient Israel part of the West. I think most folks do, because it went on to influence the West so much, the Christian religion and the Roman Empire and all of that, in the Catholic Church and whatnot, and is still the predominant religion in the West today. And so this historical figure of Jesus was a huge influence on Western culture, Western civilization, Western spirituality. Although of course, the religion that we find practiced today had nothing to do really with what Jesus actually taught or said. But we do have preserved in the Gospel of Thomas what he did teach, what he did say. I believe that the Gospel of Thomas is actually the second coming of Christ. We can think about it in those terms. People predicted the second coming of Christ and all of that. And of course, that prophecy had more to do with Jesus coming back, overthrowing Roman rule, and restoring, or reuniting Israel in ancient times, Judea, and becoming the king of the Jews and all that, and overthrowing, the Roman despots and whatnot. Of course, that never came to pass, but that was the prophecy, and that's what, they were referring to. Jesus, of course, never returned, and every few years people think he's coming back. He hasn't so far. It's been 2,000 years. I have no reason to believe that he ever will come back. But essentially, I believe that the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas is essentially the second coming of Christ, and it's a restoration of the original Christianity. As we move into the so-called Age of Aquarius and the Age of Pisces ends, Christianity has the fish, the so-called Jesus fish, as its symbol, because it also represents the Age of Pisces, which is our current astrological age that lasts for about 2,000 or so years, according to the 26,000 year cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, which I won't go into now. It's very complicated. But essentially, we're moving into the next age, which is the Age of Aquarius. And I believe as part of that transition, the original Christianity is being restored, and we can sort of move past, transcend this unfortunate version of Christianity that has been with us for the last 2,000 years, which is based on falsehoods and based so much on Paul, the so-called self-appointed Apostle Paul, who never knew Jesus and never met Jesus, and started teaching, I believe, like 20 years after Jesus' death and whatnot. And he was sort of a cult leader, what we would consider nowadays to be a cult leader, and a bit of a narcissist and egomaniac. But we do have, in the Gospel of Thomas, a return to the original Christianity. So now we can sort of brush aside all the nonsense from the last 2,000 years and return to Christ's original teachings. And so today, and by the way, I do recommend to read the book Ancient Christian Gospels by Helmut Kester if you want to know more about the scholarship around the Gospel of Thomas and why, scholars believe that it was written prior to the other so-called canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It predates them. It's older. than the Gospels you find in the Bible, meaning it was written closer to the time of Christ, which means it's more authentic and genuine and a better representation of what Christ actually taught. And it's simply a list of his teachings. There's no narrative, there's no biography really, and it's just a list of Jesus' teachings, sort of the Jesus Sutras, as it were. And so today, I'll be reading a few selected verses and giving my commentaries. Oh, and by the way, I'm reading the Thomas Lambden translation of the Gospel of Thomas. There are many translations available of the Gospel of Thomas. I resonate most with the Thomas Lambden translation, which you can easily find online. You can find all of the, well, maybe not all, but you can find most of the Gospel of Thomas translations easily online. And so if you'd like to read along with me on these podcast episodes, please use the Thomas Lambden translation to avoid confusion. Verse 28, Jesus said, I took my place in the midst of the world, and I appeared to them in flesh. I found all of them intoxicated. I found none of them thirsty. And my soul became afflicted for the sons of men, because they are blind in their hearts and do not have sight. For empty they came into the world, and empty too they seek to leave the world. But for the moment they are intoxicated. When they shake off their wine, then they will repent. What Jesus is referring to here is Maya, the grand illusion. This term Maya that we use in the yoga tradition means the matrix, the simulation, the grand illusion that we believe is real. And because we believe it's real, we suffer and we live in ignorance. Like the characters in the movie The Matrix, they have no idea they're stuck inside a false reality, and they believe it is real. And that's basically how most people live, almost everyone, except a few enlightened souls, especially in our current yuga, or cycle. We are currently in Dwapara Yuga, but just barely. I mean, the Kali Yuga just ended a couple hundred years ago. So we're still transitioning into this new era, or yuga, or time cycle, from Kali Yuga, which is a dark age, the darkest age. There's 4 yugas. Kali is the most, or is the darkest, least enlightened age. And we're just leaving that, just getting out of it. And so a lot of people leave that out of the equation. I have some friends that are sort of into a lot of new age philosophy and what I call woo-ism, woo-woo, frou-frou, woo-wooism. And for some reason, they believe we're about to move into some enlightened golden age. I see no evidence of that whatsoever. Not to be negative, but I mean, we have to use our discernment and common sense. And yeah, I don't see that happening, folks. I mean, we're just barely out of Kali Yuga. We're just barely leaving the Dark Age here in our current era of Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara Yuga, by the way, is an energy age associated with advancements in energy. Both so-called electromagnetic energy, but also discoveries of subtle energy, the astral body, and all of that. And so in the last 150 years or so, we've begun to rediscover a lot of electromagnetic properties and different forms of energy, nuclear energy, split the atom. And we've also rediscovered, especially here in the West, the astral body, subtle energies. If you look at Theosophy, the work of Madame Blavatsky, and Anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, and of course Paramahansa Yogananda, bringing all these teachings to the West from India and whatnot. We are definitely in Dwapara Yuga, and we're just at the beginning, and we're transitioning into this new sort of energy age. And then you have Treta Yuga after that, which is a mental age, where people regain their telepathic abilities and so-called psi abilities or psychic abilities. And then we have Satya Yuga, which is an enlightened age. Satya Yuga won't start until around 7000 AD, so about 5,000 years from now. So we are nowhere near any kind of golden age or enlightened age, far from it. And it's just a fact of life. We need to accept that. And this basic spiritual fact needs to be conceded and confronted. And we shouldn't engage in New Age escapism. And so Jesus says, I took my place in the midst of the world, and I appeared to them in the flesh, meaning he incarnated. He's an avatar that comes from higher realms, so-called causal planes or astral planes, okay? And I found all of them intoxicated, meaning they were all drunk on Maya. Life is like a drug, Maya is like a drug. It's quite intoxicating, quite alluring, and it's difficult to wake up from the illusion because it's addictive. These attachments and aversions we have here in the material world are quite addictive, quite hard to shake off. And so we walk around as if in a dream. Everyone is sort of in a dream state, on autopilot, sleepwalking through life. The overwhelming majority, almost everyone, except a few enlightened or semi-enlightened sages. And so Jesus incarnated into Kali Yuga. He lived and preached during Kali Yuga, really in the heart of Kali Yuga, and so people were even less enlightened than they are today, and IQs were lower, technology was far less advanced, and people were even more spiritually ignorant than they are now. And so he says, I found none of them thirsty, meaning they didn't have any spiritual thirst. They weren't spiritually thirsty or spiritually hungry because they were sleepwalking through life, again, on autopilot. They just didn't know any better. They had no idea that they were sleeping. They had no idea that they were living as if in a dream, living in a dream world, in a dream state. And they believed themselves to be people, humans with personalities and egos and minds and emotions and all of that. They had no idea that they're actually pure consciousness observing a person. And so they're fully identified with the person and its personality and mind and emotions, desires, attachments, aversions, etc. And of course, most people live like that, almost everyone. Fully identified with this particular hominid species that our souls happen to be inhabiting. Not knowing that they are spiritual beings of pure light. Pure consciousness, pure, unlimited, blissful, loving consciousness that is observing a person with its personality and ego, etc. They were ignorant, in other words. spiritually ignorant, and they had no thirst for spiritual knowledge. They just didn't know any better. They were completely entrapped in Maya. It's interesting because in Spanish, Maya means net, like a fishing net or something, a net that you could get stuck in or caught in. It's quite apt when we're talking about the grand illusion. And it says, and my soul became afflicted for the sons of men, people, because they are blind in their hearts and they do not have sight. In other words, their third eye was completely closed, and they didn't have spiritual vision, spiritual perception, and all they saw was the material reality that they were trapped inside of. They had no access to any other dimension of reality, and especially their true nature as souls, as pure conscious units of the divine. For empty they came into the world, and empty too they seek to leave the world. So they came into the world ignorant, spiritually ignorant, and they will leave the world the same way. That is the case for most souls here on this planet, especially during these darker ages. Very few people during these particular ages ascend when they die, meaning that they move on to other realms or possibly other planets that are more enlightened. Planet Earth, as we find it right now, is probably sort of like the third world ghetto of the galaxy, to put it bluntly. When I observe current events and global affairs and the comings and goings of our so-called leaders, it's frustrating a little bit, kind of sad to see our leaders in most countries behaving like children, behaving like adolescents, thinking like adolescents, and also just interacting with adults. I find that the grand majority of the vast majority of the adults I interact with behave and act and think like children in our current age. And and it's getting worse, by the way. You would think, well, we're moving out of Kali, moving into Dwapara, should be getting better, but I'm not so sure that's the case, unfortunately. As far as the arrested development of the youth is concerned, when I look at the younger generations, it does take them far longer to mature into adulthood. I was talking with a student of mine the other day, and she has her own yoga school now, and she teaches people yoga and meditation, spirituality, and all these things. And she was saying, I spend so much of my time just teaching people how to be mature. Like I can't teach a lot of yoga and spiritual philosophy and meditation and all these advanced techniques and everything to people who behave like teenagers, people in their 40s who behave like teenagers. Yeah, and I told her so much of what you will do as a quote-unquote spiritual teacher is simply teach adults how to act and behave and think like adults, which is honestly probably what I spend the majority of my time doing. And that's okay. And by the way, I'm still pretty immature in a lot of ways. So, look, I'm not judging anyone. Believe me, I'm part of this society, I'm part of this culture, and largely a product of this culture. And so I'm still growing up, in a lot of ways. But what I'm saying is that it's taking people longer and longer to mature into adulthood. Just interacting with a lot of people in their 20s, I see it. I mean, I know a lot of people in their early 20s that still behave and think and act like they're 12, 13 years old. Likewise, I interact with a lot of people in their 40s and 50s who think, act, and behave like they're 20 still. And they have kids of their own. And so then they're transmitting this immaturity to their children, and so on and so forth. It seems to be a bit of a downward spiral. And part of it is kind of by design, I would say. Coming back to this concept or idea or theme of systemic disempowerment that I continually touch on in this podcast. It seems the entire system is designed to arrest our development and stunt our growth and maturity. And so much of that is based on what we see in movies and on social media and television and news and all of that. Hollywood, all of that. It's meant to stunt our growth. It's meant to keep us immature and childlike, and with very flawed impulse control, constantly activating our so-called reptilian brains and our sympathetic nervous system to keep us in a sort of fight or flight or freeze mode, and constantly activating that sympathetic nervous system, releasing cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream and keeping us in a state of anxiety and fear and worry. And excitation also, as you look at, entertainment, the entertainment industry likes to stimulate our most base instincts, our most primal animal instincts. And that tends to stunt our growth dramatically. And so it's based upon the profit motive of the entertainment industry, the news industry, to keep us fearful and anxious and worried and excited, stimulated. Constant sensory input, constant sensory stimulation. Generating clicks, and generating profit. So it's essentially by design. So we want to activate our parasympathetic nervous system more and more, and also the higher nature, our higher human nature, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the frontal lobes, so-called, of the brain, to counteract, the junk media that we're constantly feeding ourselves. So it's really important through pranayama, meditation, yoga, listening to discourses from spiritual teachers, reading the books of the masters, reading the ancient yoga texts, and so on. We can counteract or counterbalance all of that sympathetic nervous system activation and reptilian brain activation, so that we can activate our higher nature. I was just watching, there's this popular sort of guru, I guess you could call him, Wim Hof. Very trendy right now. And I like a lot of what he has to say. He's really into the cold water therapy and this super heavy breathing. And essentially what he's doing is activating the sympathetic nervous system and releasing a lot of cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream so that you can tolerate cold water and all this. This is the opposite of what we need right now in our world. But he's very trendy, very popular. I like a lot of what he has to say, but certainly don't need any more activation of the sympathetic nervous system and more stress response and fight or flight response. That's the opposite of what we need right now. And Jesus says, but for the moment they are intoxicated, when they shake off their wine, then they will repent. So he's using this analogy of being drunk um, to sort of explain this state of spiritual ignorance. So when we're drunk, we're not very alert, are we? We're not very conscious, are we? We're not very awake and aware, are we? Which is one reason I don't drink alcohol. I don't touch the stuff. I haven't since I was about 27. It's been about 16 years. Occasionally I'll have, in Chile where I live, I mean, it's impossible to avoid. So, if we're at a social function or something, I mean, so much of the culture is just revolves around alcohol here. It's kind of unbelievable, but it is what it is, and so I adapt, and, occasionally I'll have a sip of champagne at a celebration or something, or take a couple sips of a beer or something, just not to be rude. But of course, alcohol does kill your brain cells. It lowers your IQ and really affects your liver. And people say, oh, well, yeah, but if you drink wine, it's good for your heart or something. You can just drink grape juice, has the same effect. But at any rate, so he's, and some people say, oh, well, Jesus drank wine, didn't he? Well, there's conflicting evidence with regards to that. I don't think so. John the Baptist did not. John the Baptist was Jesus' guru, basically, and John the Baptist did not drink wine. He did not eat meat. He was a vegetarian. And the Essenes generally abstained from alcohol and meat. And so I believe Jesus came from that community, the Essene community, and that he most likely did not, in fact, drink wine and did not eat meat, and that those were later additions or corruptions to the Bible. And in fact, it's very common to hear Christians and Catholics using those, a couple verses in the Bible about Jesus possibly drinking wine or whatever to justify drinking wine. I know people who drink wine every day and, get, at the very least, get a nice buzz on every day, or, at the worst, get pretty wasted and are totally addicted to wine, but they say, oh, Jesus drank wine, it's okay. And so that's a very common justification for people with, for alcoholics to use to justify their addiction. At any rate, so he uses that as an analogy. It's a very good analogy, because when we are drunk or intoxicated, we're not alert, we're not very conscious, we're not very awake, aware, present, and that's how most people walk through life and interact with the world, in a dream state, asleep to reality. Moving on to verse 29 now. Jesus said, if the flesh came into being because of spirit, it is a wonder. But if spirit came into being because of the body, it is a wonder of wonders. Indeed, I am amazed at how this great wealth has made its home in this poverty. And if you listen to the scientific materialists of our day, they will tell you that consciousness is a byproduct of the physical brain, and that actually sentience and consciousness comes about as a result of the brain and nervous system and our biology, our anatomy, our physiology. And so Jesus sort of rejects that idea here and seems to lean towards the idea that actually, you know, in fact, consciousness exists outside of the physical body, what he calls poverty. And he uses that word a few times in the Gospel of Thomas. Um, and so essentially what he's saying is, it's unbelievable that we've descended, that consciousness has descended through the stages of the causal realm, the so-called mental realm, the astral realm, or the energetic, subtle realm, um, and into this material density that we now find ourselves in. Because of ignorance, and because we have become identified with this false self and intoxicated, it's quite alluring, Maya. It offers a lot of opportunities for pleasure. But of course, uh, the um, sort of other side of that coin is pain, isn't it? There's Red Hot Chili Pepper song um, where Anthony Kiedis says, pleasure, it's always spiked with pain. And it's true. It's so true. So yeah, you can have a lot of pleasure here, but the cost of that is pain. You have to pay for it, don't you, in the end? And Jesus is saying, wow, it's unbelievable that we have descended into this poverty, into this dense meat suit, this monkey suit that we're all trapped inside of. It's amazing to him, like he can't believe it. You know, as this avatar from higher realms, he incarnates into the flesh, and he's like, what the hell? You know, how did this happen? Don't you all know that? Don't you know about this great wealth that you actually are? You know, you can ascend to higher realms and exist in other planes of existential reality, so-called, you know, higher astral planes, causal planes, and then of course, you know, at the highest level, we're pure light, pure conscious light. And so that's what he's referring to as wealth, and this dense meat suit as poverty. And so it's true that consciousness does exist apart from the physiology, the anatomy, the biological creature that it inhabits. Anyone who has had an out-of-body experience, as I have on 2 occasions, knows this. It's not a belief, you know, or anything like that. It's an experience, a lived experience, and you know, beyond the shadow of any doubt. In a future podcast episode, I will describe the 2 out-of-body experiences that I had. But needless to say, after the first experience, I knew that our consciousness is not in any way produced by the brain or the physical body, and that actually our consciousness exists apart from, or can exist apart from, the physical body, and it does in an out-of-body experience. You experience yourself as energy, as mind, but as consciousness existing apart from the physical body, especially when you look down at yourself. Well, not yourself, when you look down at the physical body that you were previously inhabiting, you realize, oh, okay, I'm not that. And then you know. It's not a belief or anything like that. It's not something that you read in a book or you saw in a documentary. It's a lived experience, and you just know. And so these scientific materialists have no idea what they're talking about. And if any of them were to have an out-of-body experience, they would change their mind immediately about these ridiculous notions of consciousness being a byproduct of the brain and nervous system. It's an absurd notion once you've had an out-of-body experience. And this last verse that I'll read today is verse 33. It's a good number. I won't go into that right now. That's a whole Pandora's box. But Jesus said, "Preach from your housetops that which you will hear in your ear. For no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel, nor does he put it in a hidden place. But rather he sets it on a lampstand, so that everyone who enters and leaves will see its light." Sometimes people ask me, and they used to ask my spiritual teacher, Roy Jean Davis, and it's a common question to so-called spiritual teachers. You know, why go out into the world and preach and teach and all of that? Why don't you just become a hermit? Why don't you live in a cave like some of these other yogis? Oh, you must have a huge ego, to go out and try to teach others about spirituality. Oh, you're a know-it-all. You must have a big ego, and you must be arrogant to want to go out in the world and shine your light and share with others. Well, no, this is just what you do. It's just part of the process. My first samadhi experience, which I talk about in my book, The Sacred Science of Yoga and the Five Koshas, which I wrote about 10 years ago. During my first experience of samadhi, what took me out of the experience, that lasted about 3 hours or so, was a thought. And that thought was, wow, I want to go share this with others. What I'm experiencing right now, I need to get up, because I had actually, you can read about it in the book, but basically I had experienced samadhi at a meditation retreat, and then I wandered into the woods, into a forest by myself, and I sat down under a tree and just in nirvikalpa samadhi, basically for about 3 hours or so. No thoughts, just completely thought-free state of pure conscious union, just union. It's the only way I can describe it. There was no subject, there was no object, there was just pure existence being. I was that. At any rate, essentially, what took me out of that experience was this one thought. Oh man, I want to share this with others. I need to get up and I need to go share what I'm experiencing with others, so that others can experience this same experience that I'm having. After that, I got up and started to walk back towards the retreat center where I was in the North Georgia Mountains. It was not Center for Spiritual Awareness, it was another retreat center. At any rate, so I started walking back, and I was having this thought, I want to share this with others, I want to share it. And then instantaneously the experience was over, and I slowly came back to earth, so to say, and identified again with this little Chris thing, this fictional character that I play, and the experience was over. But so this is very natural. It's just a natural process. When you wake up, or when you start to wake up, and I certainly, by the way, wouldn't say that I'm fully awake by any stretch of the imagination, but for people that are beginning to awaken, it's a very natural instinct to want to share that with others. You become naturally compassionate, and you want to help. You want to help others. It's like Morpheus and Neo in the movie The Matrix. They're awake. They're out of the Matrix. What's the first thing they think about? Oh, I want to go help other people leave the Matrix. right? Yeah, so it just happens. It's just part of the process. And for all of those of you who are listening, who are also awakening, I'm sure you've experienced the same. Look, I'm a very introverted, shy person. I would love to just go sit in my little hut. I built a little hut here on our in our retreat center where I meditate in the mornings. I'd love to just sit in there all day by myself, meditate, read, pray, chant. I usually spend about between an hour to 2 hours in there each day. But yeah, it'd be great if I could just stay in there all day, to tell you the truth. But I feel compelled and I feel called to share and to shine this light out into this world of darkness, this world of poverty, spiritual poverty and spiritual ignorance, and to help others wake up. And so it's just a calling. You just feel called to do it. And it's just part of the process. So don't hide your light, folks. We need more light weavers, so called, to use a quite kind of new agey term, but we do. We need light weavers, light bearers, light wielders out there in the world right now. You got to get out there and help others leave the matrix, wake up from this dream, this illusion. Help others realize that they are beautiful spiritual beings of pure light, and that they're not this poverty that they see reflected in the mirror. And by the way, the body is fine, you know. And part of the awakening process and enlightenment process is a physiological process. And so, a lot of it occurs here in the body, and you change your brain, you rewire the brain, and you refine your nervous system, and all of that. And once you start producing amrita in the brain and swallowing it and everything, you begin to really spiritualize the rest of the body. And it's this physiological process that occurs, this kundalini process and all of that. And so there's nothing wrong with the body. But at some point, you want to ascend. You want to leave this dense plane, dense dimension behind, and ascend to the astral realms, the heavens, so called. That's the spiritual path, you see. Now, some will say, oh, well, the bodhisattvas, they take this vow to keep coming back here time and again to help others, assist others in their journey and their path. And that's good. That's very noble also. But I'm pretty sure that they spend some time in those higher planes in between births, hanging out with some of the masters there and learning and whatnot. And so there's nothing wrong with that either. There's nothing wrong with it, with getting out of the matrix and ascending to higher realms. So many of the spiritual teachings that we find in all traditions are about ascension. Even within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we find the teachings around the rainbow body, which are about ascension. These masters, these lamas or rinpoches, when they die, they ascend to, with their rainbow body, their astral body, to astral realms, and they exist there for a time. Perhaps they decide to come back at some point, but they have that decision. You see, they can make the decision. They can choose to come back. It's not compulsive or automatic, in other words, like it is for the vast majority of souls. And so we want to get to a place where we have that freedom to choose to come and go at will, rather than being a cog in the wheel of the cosmic matrix of Maya, of samsara. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you'll share the podcast with others. Please visit my website to possibly purchase a book or peruse my blog articles or YouTube channel. It's koshasbook.com, koshasbook.com, and I'll put a link, as always, in the description of the podcast episode. Lots of love. Namaste.